Hello, everybody. Welcome to our TF Search seminar again. We have had a break, and now we are back into business. And first of all, 恭喜发财, 恭喜发财, Happy Lunar New Year, Happy New Year of the Ox. And actually, today is the Chinese Valentine's Day. Do you know that? So we are so honored to have Dr. Marianne Turner on the Chinese Valentine's Day, which is the 15th of January of the lunar calendar. And today, the lunar calendar is the 15th, is the Chinese Valentine's Day, or they also call the Lantern's Day. Okay. Before we start our exciting seminar, I'd like to make an announcement. While there are many people here, we will have the next TLTS live stream seminar, research seminar from Dr. Coxing Tang from Curtin University in Perth. And the topic will be discourse strategies for science teaching and learning. That's on March 27 in Australian time and March 26 in North American time. Okay, so discourse strategies for science teaching and learning. Professor Coxing Tang, a very science educator, also who studied the role of languages and literacies in science education. Okay, now without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Marianne Turner, my very good friend from Monash University in Melbourne. I was about to visit her last March about this time, but then the lockdown came in. So, but thanks to technology, we can have her broadcast to all of us. And you can look at Dr. Turner's bio. She has a rich experience in language and literacy education and has taught in Japan, in Asia, and now she is associate professor in the Monash University. Without further ado, I will hand the speaking floor over to Dr. Turner, and she will first do a PowerPoint presentation, and then we will have our host to interact and ask questions. And so remember, you can also type in your questions on the YouTube, and then we will read out your questions for Dr. Turner to address them. Okay, over to you, Marianne.
Thank you, Angel. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And also thank you to everyone, to the research group as well, for inviting me here today. It's a real pleasure. I have to say that I've been really enjoying your seminars. I've been listening to them with great interest, and yeah, I'm very happy to be here today. So I'm going to talk about something that I love, which is also a lot of fun to do, translanguaging theory and languages education. So this is something that I think about a lot, and it's a very complex space. And what I'll try to do in this presentation is to really show where I'm coming from in this space and in my context. Okay, so sorry, just let me try to change. Yes, oh no. Yes, I can do it. Okay, so can you still see me? Oh, good, I can't see myself now. Okay, so what I am starting with is thinking about what a theory is. And I often do this with my work, because what I try to do is work a lot with teachers and work a lot with trying to get ideas, theoretical ideas, into practice. And so I also set myself the challenge of trying to explain things in not a simple way, but in as clear a way as I can. So the way that I'm understanding theory when I'm talking about translanguaging theory is it's a formal idea or set of ideas that is intended to explain something. So I just took this from a dictionary. I'm fascinated by dictionary definitions, but I do think it is really useful to say, well, this is what I am thinking that a theory is. So the idea, and I've got to say that I set myself this challenge for this seminar. I haven't done this before, trying to think, okay, well, how can I explain translanguaging theory, or the idea that I understand it to be, in as simple a way as I can. This is what I came up with, and it took a little while. Thinking and communicating processes that go beyond socially constructed linguistic boundaries. So this is what's about thinking and communicating as processes. But given the influential nature of socially constructed boundaries, bi-multilingualism is positioned as the norm. Yes. Ah, okay. So this is what I thought. Well, just give me a second. I've lost myself. I was wondering if maybe you couldn't see because. Ah, see, that's what I'm not seeing. Just a second. Aha, I think I've got it. Is that it? Yes, I did. I was a bit worried. I thought, oh, maybe you can't see this. Okay, so I won't repeat, but I've talked about the theory and also this first idea. Okay, so translanguaging theory, and what's the idea that I see behind the theory? So process, thinking and communication, and going beyond socially constructed linguistic boundaries, but recognizing that they're there. So I think that that's a very important part of translanguaging theory as I work with it. And what I really like about it and what attracts me to it is that bi-multilingualism is positioned as the norm. So instead of talking about language and then bi-multilingualism as something that's peripheral, it's right dead center of the theory. So I think that is very attractive as a way of promoting linguistic diversity and the breadth of linguistic repertoire that I'm interested in. So also the linguistic boundaries might be perceived to be connected to language variation associated with one named language or with different named languages. I also like this idea. I know it's something that that Angel's played with too in terms of trans and then slash and then languaging. I kind of see the slash in my mind. So translanguaging does include languaging as well in the way that I use it, because I try to be inclusive of people who perceive themselves to be monolingual. And I will explain why I try to do that in a moment. So what I see it as being intended to explain is the way that the way that language relates to our cognitive processes and the way we communicate. So it's interested in both these things. And I've borrowed from Hawkins and Murray here that meaning making in a holistic sense, which includes context and is not limited to individual factors. So it's what's happening around the individual as much as what's happening inside the individual. And I think it's important because of translanguaging and the way that it gets interpreted in different ways to talk about where I'm coming from, my own positioning and why I'm interested in it, because I think the way I'm interested in it dictates the kinds of things and the kinds of ways that I use it. So what I'm very interested in, and I have explored this with Angel in the past, is thinking about translanguaging theory as a majority theory. And I think that this is quite important, at least in my context, I see it as very important, because at a pragmatic level, I have two interests. Well, I have lots of interests, but I just talk about two interests. And these interests emerge from my own interactions, historical trajectory, environment, opportunities, everything to do with me and what's around me. So I am very, very interested in a language enrichment perspective. So I try to think about how to extend people's linguistic repertoires, including my own and my own family's, and thinking that it's wonderful if people can speak more than one language because it gives them depth and breadth of linguistic repertoire. And in Australia, generally speaking, by about the third generation, migrants to Australia are speaking English almost entirely. So there's a lot of language attrition that happens, and language maintenance is something that I really think about. So often when people talk about, migrants coming to a country and they translanguage, they have their own language practices and then they have English. sometimes that doesn't happen. So often parents think that it's not the right thing to be speaking in their language to their children, and their children don't end up speaking their language. This happens a lot in Australia. I think it probably happens elsewhere too, but this is a big part of my own context. So this is an interest that I have. A second interest I have is that I would like to try and work out how people who don't have access and exposure to other languages outside school can learn languages inside school. I think that that's really important. And this is part of the reason why I think that translanguaging theory needs to be a majority theory rather than relegated to, oh, the migrants. Oh, that's the theory for the, the people who need help with English. And it tends to happen, and it's already starting to happen a bit in discourse, that, oh, translanguaging is for EAL students, for English as an additional language students. And I don't think that that should be the case. And so this is why I think that showing that it's a majority theory is very important. So my interest is thinking about communication with ourselves as well as with others in order to learn. And this includes learning language. So we'll talk about learning through language and learning language as well. Okay, so this is just a summary of the people who I think about a lot. So I have English as an additional language learners, people who need help speaking English in school in order to access learning at school in Australia. Students who have community exposure to other languages. So they don't really need help with English. They're fine with English at school, and they might be hearing other languages at home, and they might be speaking those languages to very different degrees. So some students speak to their parents in the language of their parents or their grandparents. Others just understand and speak back in English. And it's a very, very wide range in people I look at or I work with in schools. And the third group is learning a language at school that they can also use for learning in different curriculum areas, including English. So this is the content and language integrated learning approach, which I'm very interested in, and trying to get some kids learning languages at school. Okay, and so this is translanguaging, the kinds of pedagogical goals that are associated with translanguaging, and what you can get from drawing on students' wider linguistic repertoire. So helping co-construct knowledge and also help students to display their knowledge if they can display it well in using certain linguistic practices and not so much in others. Promoting metalinguistic and cross-linguistic awareness, I'm very interested in, and I'll explain that later too. Affirming multilingual identities is a pleasure, and again, I'll talk about that. Letting people be who they are is a wonderful thing, and supporting social justice and critical reflection on language inequality. This is a little bit harder in my context at schools because English is so taken for granted, but just the fact that you can disrupt the way things happen in schools by bringing other languages in, I think is a really good start. Okay, so I also think what I like about the translanguaging perspective is that it is about the speaker. It's about people and what they do with language. It's not starting with language and working with language, but it's starting with the speaker. And I think that it's possible to include the context of the speaker, which is really nice too. And this is what I work with. I try to think, well, how can we think about all the language, the linguistic repertoire that the students have, and the way that the schools think about it, and we see the opportunities to learn that come from this. So first, school-based expectations of language use and language learning. I also think of as a multilingual stance. I know I don't use the words translanguaging stance always to schools because it's a very pragmatic choice saying multilingual because they are more used to the term multilingual. I use a translanguaging lens in my own work, but sometimes it's a kind of a give and take between what people are going to understand and work with and what's going to make them a bit more nervous. So here, I like Esther de Jong's continuum. She thought of it on a continuum, this idea of bringing languages into the class, this passive acceptance of students' use of language practices. So teachers allowing languages in, but it's very passive. They don't really do anything with them. And then further along, you have this idea of teachers actively providing opportunities for students to use extended language practices for different purposes in class. This is further along, but it also really often gets interpreted as a scaffold. So if, for example, the EAL students, they can't speak English properly, you know, so maybe they need some help. So we'll help them out, and they can, you know, so it's moving along. But I would say that I'm trying to aim for all students at the bottom there. So language is being considered a resource for learning for everyone. Not just, you know, for people, because they need it. And that is because that really sticks with that deficit idea of, they're just not good enough at something, rather than thinking about all the things that they know. Okay, so this fits. So here, the way, and I wrote about this in a book that I recently wrote about multilingual practices in schools. And what I was trying to do was think about it in a broad lens of a way to look at what's happening in schools and how you can increase, or how we can increase opportunities to learn by looking through a translanguaging lens, or looking at language in a holistic way. So multilingual stance, I found in schools, was a big part of this. So the school's expectations of what they should be doing in class, whether they were allowing languages into the class, for example, different languages, was important. But also student engagement with languages. So what students were willing to do in the class. Like, just because students do have a very wide linguistic repertoire, it's a real assumption to think that, you know, maybe they want to use it all. Or maybe you think that they have a particular repertoire because you've been told that, you know, their parents are from Korea, for example. So teachers often assume that means that they speak Korean at home, but they might not actually be speaking Korean. Their parents might be, but they might not be. So student engagement with languages is very important to understand as well. And then there's the institutional structures and pedagogies. And these things all together show opportunities to learn through linguistic repertoire in a holistic sense. So what I did, and I won't go through this because it will take a bit too long, but just to show that what I tried to do is put data, so from research projects that I had done, into this idea, into this multilingual kind of opportunities to learn framework. And so the opportunities to learn cover different kinds or different aspects of linguistic repertoire. Okay, so instead of just looking at English or French or Japanese or something like that, it's just thinking, okay, well, learning, what can we learn through looking at all the linguistic repertoire that's in the classroom. I did look at a class level rather than a school level. Okay, and this is a school, this is another project, and it's a different context. It's a bilingual context, and I found that this was quite different. The one that I showed you before, that was 3 schools where it was not bilingual, but they had over 80% of students who were language background other than English students. That's what they called in Australia, language background other than English. So they all spoke different languages to varying degrees, or those 80% of students did. The bilingual program was quite a different context. This was a Japanese English bilingual program, and there were over 80% of the students were speaking languages other than English at home, actively speaking these languages, and about a third of the students spoke Japanese at home. So there were a lot of other languages being spoken as well. It was a very language sensitive school. And because it was language sensitive, it meant that teachers were able to bring more into the classroom. So it's a very nice thing about bilingual programs, is that's often the case. Okay, so I know that was a bit of a whirlwind of those two, but it's really the idea that you can use translanguaging theory really helps set up a kind of framework that can help schools think through the way languages are being used and think through a language policy for their school in order to really access the linguistic repertoire of students. So I think in terms of working towards teaching and learning objectives, and translanguaging theory, rather than working or if you're thinking about teaching languages in particular, rather than thinking I'm working towards this named language, you know, I find it easier to think, well, I'm working towards this teaching and learning objective. Okay, so the idea really is to increase the linguistic repertoire of the students, but the teaching and learning objective is related to what the school wants and what the students need to do in order to do well in school. Okay, so this is actually empirical. What I'm saying here with the teaching and learning objectives is what I saw in the schools as being the objectives of what the teachers and students were doing. Okay, and I divided these out. They overlap, but I found it useful to divide them out in order to help advise schools about language policy. But learning languages, including across the curriculum, and leveraging languages as a resource for learning. Okay, so learning languages, these were the different ways of learning languages I saw. So learning a language in language classes, and this can be content related as well. So I did see teachers doing this. I saw them taking, for example, a Japanese teacher going to history teachers and saying, okay, so what are you doing in the history classes? And then adapting what they were doing so that he could teach Japanese history to his students in the Japanese classroom in order to help them learn Japanese. So I thought that was a really, really nice thing to do. So, but learning language in any way, learning content related target language in different subject areas was also something that was very visible. Something that was less visible, it was there, it was less visible, is using a target language for everyday communication. And this seemed to be something that was a big struggle in schools. But these were the three categories for learning language, for the teaching and learning objectives. Leveraging languages as a resource for learning. The first one was really the first, celebrating and valuing multilingual identities. Teachers really loved doing this, and it was such a pleasure that they loved doing this. That this is why they saw in my project, especially with the 3 primary schools who were teaching in schools where there were a lot of language background other than English kids, that's what they said, this is why this is good. Like bringing their languages in, it's bringing the students to life. They're just loving this. And so that was their reason really for doing it. The general learning and instruction took a little bit more thought because it needed to be tied to the curriculum, the achievement standards, that kind of thing. But some teachers were able to do that very well. And I also saw that in high schools too. For example, I saw a great potential for Japanese. It was a Japanese, so it was kanji, but all Chinese characters, it's the same potential of bringing ways of knowing into English in different ways, so the students can understand things in a different way. In science, for example, it comes back, the translation comes back into English differently, and the students were understanding more deeply. And the last one, reflecting critically on language, and this did come last. So I didn't see this as much as I saw the other 2, but teachers were starting to do it because they realized that, for example, when languages were coming into the classroom, because students were bringing other languages in, if students were monolingual, sometimes they were saying, oh, this is boring, I don't like this, you know, because they didn't feel included. And this was the teachers were reflecting more critically on language because of this, thinking, well, you know, instead of saying, okay, well, let's shut this down, thinking, well, you know, isn't it good if we get these students to be learning language too? Like they should be bringing some language in too. So trying to work out how they could get these students interested in bringing more language in. So disrupting the hierarchy. Not instead of, okay, only English is dominant, thinking, no, we still want other languages to have some place, and we're going to have to bring these kids to the party. Okay, so just talk a little bit too, just to give a few more examples of what I've been doing. The Japanese, the 50-50 bilingual program is where I do a lot of research. It's a longitudinal project. And just to show what things look like a bit in the classroom. So in terms of learning, like trying to use this idea of linguistic repertoire in a holistic sense to get kids learning more effectively. There was in this particular school an English teacher and a Japanese teacher collaborated. It was a year 1 class, so they would be 7 or 8 year olds, and they were learning how to build ideas. So I've thought of it as active learning, but it's dialogic pedagogy, really. It's trying to work out how to get students to help each other think about things and get ideas themselves. So these started in the English classroom because the students were their English, they were more comfortable with their English than with their Japanese. They did very well with Japanese. So the English teacher called it paraphrasing. And so one student was active listening, was thinking, okay, well, how can I help the other student? And this is actually, I didn't really know this, so I learned a lot from observing this, but the year 1s had a lot of trouble with this in the beginning. They they just wanted to talk, and they waited for each other to stop talking, and so they could start talking. And so that's what the teacher was really trying to break down with this. And it took a while. This is what she gave them, the example. And this is an example of two students talking to each other. There's a lot here, but really what I would like to show you with this is how S2, the second student, was really trying to understand the story of the first student and was repeating bits of the story back or just trying to change the wording. And you can see that the first student said, no, 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 all the way to the end until finally, just at the end, S1 says yes, and S2, okay, I get it. Now, to be completely honest, I hadn't got it by the end, but it looked like the second student had got it, which was really good. So they didn't just stop and wait for the person to wait for the other student to stop speaking, and that's what the teacher was really working on with these students. And then the Japanese teacher took this idea of active listening and building ideas into the Japanese classroom. And she needed to scaffold more because the kids needed more help with the Japanese. And so she gave the kids The Very Hungry Caterpillar, that story, and told them to summarize it. But you can see here in this dialogue that there's the same idea of helping, of prompting, of active listening. One student trying to do the summary by themselves and the other student helping out with this kind of paraphrasing. So the idea here is that it's learning dialogic pedagogy. It's learning how to build ideas together. And also the way that I approach translanguaging is it doesn't necessarily have to be happening in the same class. It's the linguistic repertoire of the speakers, and it can be distributed across classes and the way that learning happens. And I would say in bilingual programs, and when the children are learning a language at school, having a space for that language is important if they don't have exposure to the language outside. So translanguaging and bringing other languages into those classrooms, into the minority language classroom, needs a lot of thought. Okay, and this is another example here of language analysis this time, and this was foundation. So this was the first year, preparatory year at school, and the teacher was teaching sentence structure in English, and he drew on different languages in the classroom to try to show the students how sentences were structured differently in different languages. This was particularly useful for students who were not speaking English at home. He found that their sentence structure really improved with this kind of activity. And again, the students, they were so excited to see the languages that they knew being brought into the classroom. At a different level, this was a year 5-6, so this is the last, year 6 is the final year of primary school in Australia. The students were bringing different languages into the classroom and doing similar activity just at a higher level. So here they were colour coding according to participants, process and circumstance. So chunking meaning in the sentence and thinking about where the meaning went in relation to what they were reading in English. So this was in the English class, the teachers were bringing other languages or the linguistic repertoire of the students into the class in a way that we were a little bit nervous about doing in the Japanese class. Okay, so in conclusion, translanguaging theory allows me, when I'm thinking about it, to consider learning a language alongside leveraging languages as a resource for learning. So it can help guide decisions about deploying students' and teachers' language practices and about how to collaborate effectively with other teachers. So that's the way that I use it. Thank you very much. I'll stop the share now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turner. I'd like to hand it over to our host, our student host and our postdoc host. Maybe over to you, Pedro, first, and then Phoebe, and then people can just jump in anytime. Pedro, you have some questions for Marianne?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Dr. Turner, for the presentation. Translanguaging is also a theory that is very close to me. I'm a multilingual speaker. I teach languages. I research languages, so it resonates a lot with my identity and as an individual, as a language teacher as well. So I am fascinated by translanguaging. I have a question about the context in which I am investigating, which is in higher education, in academic settings. I know that you focused on elementary education, but it's I think that we can think about the theory in different ways. So you and Dr. Lin, you claim that desire is an important element in the discussion of named languages, because the fact that named languages bring with them the atrocities of colonization. They happen in many places, and also the inequities. They are desired by the learners, and this is a sign that these named languages, they will be perpetuated in a way. So then there is a critical reflection that you encourage everyone, and I think that this is part of your framework as translanguaging as a theory. So the ways students use and desire this named language and how this named language is added to the students' repertoire has to be seen in a critical way. So I'm thinking about international students who go to other places and they speak English as an additional language, and they desire to learn this language, so attached to the desire of having a degree in one profession. So this is the context in Canada, and of course in Australia as well. And the elements of colonization is there. So do you think that translanguaging theory can also be used as lenses for other contexts besides elementary education, and also secondary and post-secondary as well? And how can teachers think about this theory when they have their students in class? They know that they bring different languages, they have their linguistic repertoires, but they also have their desire to learn the languages and their degrees. Thank you. Sorry for the long question.
No, it's very, very interesting, and I'm fascinated by it as well. I mean, I do my own research. I am looking in at primary mainly and also secondary, but I do have a PhD student at Min Lu. I hope she's listening now. I think she's listening now, and she is doing a project on international Chinese students in Australian university, and looking through a translanguaging lens at their practices. So I certainly think that it's very useful. It's great. It's appropriate to be looking at it at university as well. It is very difficult. The whole idea of desire I think is very hard, and she has found that in her. I wish I could invite her to the talk, but she has found that in her own work, that the students do want English, and they do want space. They want to be speaking in English. They say they want to practice their English. They think that it's appropriate that the tutor is, even if the tutor could speak Chinese, they don't necessarily want the tutor to speak Chinese, that this is an English speaking environment. And I think one of the participants also wanted to speak to her in English in the interviews, even though they both spoke Chinese. And so it's a very big deal, like the desire thing. And I've felt it myself, and I've learned other languages too, just wanting to be a part of this imagined community. It's very strong. And I think that we need to respect the individual. I see a real tension between individuals and what they want, and trying to disrupt the system as a whole. Because if you try to disrupt it with the individual, they suffer. They're the ones who suffer, because you're not necessarily giving them access to the power that is there at the moment, you know. But I think that with translanguaging lens, and what I find really interesting about it at the higher education level too, is that you see things more clearly. It's not, it is a critical lens, and that's a very, very important part of it, but it's also just seeing things. So for example, I was in Spain. I lived in Spain for a while. My husband's Spanish, and I had to get my PhD homologa. I had to, it was the homologación. I don't know how to say it in English, because I didn't have to do it in English. I can't think of the word. Translanguaging. I just translanguaged. But anyway, what I had to do was I had to write the abstract in. I had to write the abstract in Spanish, so that they could say, okay, well, this is what it's about, and we recognized. There it is. That's the English word. Recognized in Spain. And I wrote it, and I was a bit worried about my Spanish, and so I asked a friend who had actually written his PhD. He was Spanish, but he'd written it in English, and it was on maths. And I said, what do you think? And he just started laughing when he saw it. And I said, well, tell me, you know, what have I done wrong? And he said, well, it's all correct, but it's just not how I would say it. I just wouldn't say it like that. And that's what I find fascinating. And I think with translanguaging, you can explore that. You know, the fact that translanguaging, you can actually translanguage within what people would say one language is. So I always thought that I was writing in Spanish, but I wasn't. I was writing. I was just writing. I had everything that I know in English was going into my Spanish. It wasn't just Spanish. It's me, you know, and that is really, really interesting to explore, because the more you explore that, the more you can actually explain, well, to students, well, this is what you're doing, and this is the Chinese that's coming in. So I'm saying Chinese because this is what my student is working with. This is the Chinese coming into the writing. Now you think this is English, and people would say this is English, but there is a lot of your way of thinking here, and your way of thinking has kind of come from a different, you know, environment. And so it's, I think, in a way of helping people attain their desire, it actually works too.
Yeah.
So sorry, that was a very long way of answering the question.
So that's a
No,
translingual awareness, pragmatic translingual awareness. Yeah. I think this ties in well with Bongi, Dr. Song, my postdoc here in Simon Fraser University. It ties in well with your question about diversity without access.
Oh, okay. So I'm just trying to grapple with the notion of translanguaging. And first of all, I really appreciate your claim of we need to think about translanguaging not as a marginal, but translanguaging as a majority theory. And I think we need to really think about how to put that into this as a mainstream idea. So, but if we are, but I'm just wondering, though, if we are emphasizing the speaker's linguistic repertoire, that moves away from like hierarchies of power, and
the dominant linguistic codes and linguistic capital in Baudusian terms, right?
Right,
the dominant capitals, linguistic capitals.
Yeah. And I'm if we are just emphasizing celebrating the diversity without like considering, for example, high stake educational systems, that is like monolingualism that is highly associated with the high stake educational access to the high stake educational systems, higher education, and so forth. I'm just wondering whether this celebration can be celebrating diversity without access. Which
That's Hilary Zhang's discussion, right? The
Right.
access paradox. Yeah.
Yeah, and could you please elaborate how translanguaging enables students to and teachers to strategically navigate those hierarchies of language, and while still maintaining the essence of translanguaging?
No, it's something I think about a lot, because it is really hard, isn't it? It's hard to be disruptive and empowering at the same time, because if you're empowering people, you're empowering them to do something, you know, like it's something that is already, you know, so it is a very difficult space. I like the idea. I read Ryuko Kubota and what she was saying about that, and the fact that it is really important to make sure that the people you're aiming to help actually get helped. And my take on that is that a translanguaging lens, as I was saying, so a translanguaging lens helps us understand language more effectively. It helps us see a bigger picture. And once we see that bigger picture, then we can determine, it's I think, easier for us to determine how to proceed. So if you, for example, with teaching and learning objectives, if you think about it as teaching and learning objectives, you don't think about it as learning a language. You know, it's just, this is the objective that we need to get the students to because they want to do this. This is their trajectory. But within that trajectory, there is spaces for, you know, you can be critical there are spaces for that kind of thing. So I actually think of it as a continuum where so for example, in bilingual education, so I think about that a lot. You have named language at either end. And then you have all the translanguaging space in the middle. And that translanguaging space is really the lived space, you know, and the named language is a teaching, it's a pragmatic objective because it's going to give the students something that they need or they want, you know, but that lived space is where you think, okay, well, we need to get there. It's like teaching science or teaching something, you know, like I need that achievement standard. I need to get there, but it's not actually how you get there is up to you. And I think that it's a bit, I get a bit nervous when people talk about translanguaging as it's something that you just let everybody do it, you know, just go for it. I know that my students get worried about that too. So I did a research project a couple of years ago, and I taught in an EAL in the mainstream unit where teaching pre-service teachers how to cater to the needs of their EAL students in their classrooms. So it was an elective unit, and I had a lot of students, and I was interested in what they thought about translanguaging. And I called it a multilingual stance because I didn't have much time with them. And so I thought, okay, well, let's just see how comfortable they would be bringing the language into the class. And most of them said yes, 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 because they knew that's what I wanted them to say. But in the assessment, I said that the critical reflection was the most important thing. So they could actually say whatever they liked, but they just had to rationalize it, which was really interesting. So I had about 5 or 6 students who were not happy with it. They didn't like the idea at all. And they had been EAL students themselves. So they had come to Australia as Chinese international students, studied in secondary school, and then they were becoming teachers in Australia. And that means that they needed to be, that's really important to me. Like if you have that experience and you're saying, no, I don't think this is a good idea, then we should be listening to those people. Yeah. And that's what they were worried about it. They said, no, they're not learning. I go out, they're just speaking Chinese all the time and they're not speaking English and they need to learn English. So in those, I think that with the translanguaging lens, it needs to be strategic. So it's very, very important. And this is how I'm thinking now, that in that class, I have to explain to people how helping, like bringing the Chinese into the class and showing the Chinese next to the English is actually going to help their English. But then it has to. You know, you have to prove that it does. And this is where empirical research is really, really important, to show that it is. If this is what people want, then we need to be fair to that. So yeah, I think that it's really important to remember that access, we need to give access.
I think, sorry, Bungie, I just here. I think Hilary Jangser talks about both giving access and also raising critical awareness to disrupt the hierarchy. So say, for example, I have colleagues who are Chinese, and then we have students coming all the way from China or Asia, and they say, I don't want to be taught by you. Why should I come all the way from China to Canada to be taught by another Chinese professor? I want to have a native English speaker to teach me. So my colleagues were heartbroken and really very hurt. But you could see that this is this kind of ideological desire, emotional attachment, and we have to disrupt it. So, my PhD student in Hong Kong, Amy Wu, she's now listening. We have to stress that translanguaging is not just for scaffolding. Otherwise, it's still instrumental, and it's still, you need to withdraw scaffolding, and it's still the hierarchy is disrupted. So you just provide access, that's the other extreme, without disrupting the hierarchy. So I think Hilary Jang's makes the case for a critical, pragmatic approach that we both provide access, but we also raise critical awareness, the importance. So those students who made my colleague felt so heartbroken to say, I don't want to be taught by another Chinese here in Canada. I want to be taught by a white Caucasian English native speaker. I was just blown away by hearing this story. It's so heartbroken. Now, this Chinese student, I respect her feelings, right? I pay so much. I came all the way. I had to be taught by a white Caucasian native speaker teacher. This is what Sue Mother and I talked about. Sorry for my emotions, because I share in my colleagues' emotions that you could be so hurt by your Chinese fellow countrymen and countrywomen, right? It's precisely because we need to raise critical awareness. Otherwise, we just perpetuate the hierarchy. We provide access and we reproduce the hierarchy. Sorry for my emotional sharing, but I was so hurt when I heard the story from my colleague. And it's not time I heard another story from Dr. I.C. Lee, the Phoebe related the story when I.C. was teaching in Simon Fraser University in the 1990s. Dr. I.C. Lee from Hong Kong. And she was also confronted by another Chinese student saying, what you teach are so good and you're so well prepared. And I really like the content, but I don't like your accent. And again, she was, you see, all these ideological and also emotional desires, the post-colonial, so-called post-colonial desires for colonial accents. Sorry for the emotional sharing, but it's emotional because you can get hurt by these desires, colonial desires. And translanguaging, like Marianne says, gives us this critical lens. We are not just doing scaffolding. So that's the transformative potential of translanguaging lens. It's not just, okay, use your L1, use your home languages, as scaffolding is transitional, and you will all learn the target languages and take away your home languages, your home identities. We are not for that. Okay. Anyway, over to you, Bongi. Sorry for jumping in, and then Qinghua.
Oh no, just it's a clarification question though. Just because you mentioned about translanguaging awareness, and I'm also wondering about how is it differ from language awareness we have that has been living for in our literature in so long, and what is new about that, and to let us have some kind of critical lens.
I definitely, that's a really good question. I'll answer that. I just wanted to comment what Angel was saying, and I completely, I can see, and I think it is a really emotional thing, and I the way that you get categorized and pigeonholed, and I know, I mean, in Australia that doesn't happen to me. In Japan it did. I was categorized and pigeonholed. I was something that it drove me crazy, you know. And also in Spain, I get very emotional in Spain, just that people will not, it's so hard to just get people to accept that I speak Spanish and I just want to be one more. I just want to be one more. You know, please don't call me English. I'm not English. You know, I'm Australian, and I just, you know, so in that sense, I understand, and I think that it's awful. Like the fact that it's a professional identity as well. The fact that it makes it even worse. I think for people working in Australia, and I know that they suffer from that too. And I think that it is one of the hardest things is that it does come from the students. And I think that, and the parents too, and trying to, it's a real challenge, you know, trying to work out in schools, like when parents say, no, you're not speaking Chinese at school, you have to speak English at school, you're not allowed to speak any Chinese. And Chinese is like, the kids whisper often, the kids are whispering, I hear, because you know, I'm doing that, they're self-police. You know, the fact that they're speaking it, and trying to break down that is very hard. The only answer I have, and I'm not really very happy with the answer, and this is why I'm putting it out there, because I think it'd be really nice to talk about different kinds of answers in a pragmatic way of what's happening at school, is to say, well, this language, if you use it, you are going to get to your objective faster. You are going to learn English faster if you allow us to show you how bringing the language in is going to help. You are going to get to your objective faster if you have that teacher who speaks in that accent, because they know about language and they can help you with language much more than some Caucasian down the street. You said just because they look this way, it really doesn't mean that they're going to be able to help you with language. So being able to have those kinds of conversations with people, you know, I think that's the only, and to get towards a particular objective. And at the moment, that objective very much is English in Australia, the way it's taught in Australia. I wish it was taught differently, because it does mean that I really like dialogic pedagogy. I think it's a wonderful thing. It gets killed often with the way that the teachers have to do things, but that's a different kind of discussion. So that's it's a very, very slow process, and it's not just about educating teachers. Sometimes I think that educating teachers is the easiest. It's the easier thing to do. It's everything else that is kind of hard. With the what you're saying, Bonki, the translanguaging awareness and how it's different from language awareness. I mean, it's not really. If you think about language as language is everything. What I like about translanguaging is that it does recognize that at least there are socially constructed ideas of different languages, and language awareness can cross those without calling it code switching. So if you, like what I was saying about me writing something, and it becomes a mixture. It becomes, what is it? Is it Spanish? Is it English? It's neither. And I'm not code switching either. You know, I'm just writing from what I thought that I knew, you know. So I think that that's what translanguaging brings to the table for me. And the fact that it just positions that as central, the fact that somebody would have what they consider to be more than one language is central. It's not peripheral. That's my answer. Oh.
Tinghua, you just raised your hand, so you had a question to follow up?
Oh yeah. I think I want to make a comment and also answer and also ask a question. So the comments that I want to make is that for the students who are so angry at being taught by another Chinese in Canada, So I've met those kind of students too, and I personally find out that they usually themselves may have invested a lot to acquire certain accents. So it's the accent that they are able to perform in front of people has become part of their asset, like in this scenario. And somehow in the situation, if we bring translanguaging awareness into the classroom and tell them, okay, so it's okay to speak Chinese and it's okay to not speak English all the time, so they somehow we can understand that their emotional construction, sometimes they will feel that they have invested too much in the past and all their investment have like now gone in vain. So I really like the idea that Dr. Turner actually bring about, to have those conversations with them,
Yeah.
to say that to say that why it is so, why translanguaging awareness is not going to be like make all your hard working in vain. I mean, if you acquire good English skills, then you still have your good English skills. We are not taking away that from you. So we just deconstruct this kind of a confrontation a bit. So I think this is one of the comments that I want to make. The other comments that I want to say, the other question that I want to ask is, just now you mentioned you've met a few students who refuse to speak Chinese in the class. They think that translanguaging is not a good idea. But I would like to say that maybe, even though they have been pushing themselves to speak English all the time, their Chinese awareness and the translanguaging awareness still works in their repertoire somewhere in here, even though on the surface they may be speaking English all the time. But I don't believe that they have all of a sudden forgot all of their Chinese for the past 10 years that they have accumulated. So maybe would you agree that if we bring translanguaging awareness into the classroom, our strategy is not to force you to speak Chinese if you are from China, maybe. I mean, you are allowed to use English if you want, and if you feel that maybe somehow using some Chinese would better serve the needs of making your meaning, then you will probably use it. But for others, I mean, there's certain kind of a freedom. I think it's my question is, this kind of freedom is very difficult to like make it a very clear strategy. If you don't want to use Chinese, then you are given the rights to use English. Would you agree with that as well? To say that, I mean, you are not obligated to speak Chinese if you're from China in this classroom, right?
Oh no, I would. Yes, I think that would be wrong. Like, I think that people should be able to do what they want to do, and they should be able to use their linguistic repertoire. They should be invited to use it, and to also be invited to think about how they use it. And this is something that I think is really interesting and important, like for my own students. So I teach a lot of international students I teach in the Master of TESOL, and a lot of students are international, and I look at their writing, and I think about it. They actually teach me a lot about, for example, because I have a lot of Chinese international students, they teach me a lot about the way that Chinese is organized and the metaphor in Chinese in the way that they write English. So I feel like I find it fascinating. I love it. You know, the kinds of the ways that they choose to say things in a way that I wouldn't have chosen to say it in that way. It is actually making English sing. You know, like when metaphors are alive, you know, they're not completely dead. It can be really, really interesting. For example, something that just came to my mind is blossom. I don't know why, but my students often write that ideas or something blossoms. You know, I would not say that. And I don't know where that's coming from, but it's happening more than once. You know, I don't think it's coming from one individual student, and it does tend to come from when the Chinese students are writing. So just these ideas and these ways of expressing, they do come in. And just making sure that students are aware that, yeah, as you say, you know, even they might be speaking in English, but they've got all of this experience and all of this linguistic experience in their mind that's helping them. It's not just a hindrance. So what seems to be coming out of my student Min Lu's study a lot is this idea that Chinese is not good for English thought. Like if you want to think in English, you have to leave your Chinese at the door, you know. But that's, and if once you know that, and this is what's so lovely about Minlu's study, I think, is it once you see that clearly that this is what people are thinking, then you can address it. Then you say, well, no, you know, this is it's not just a hindrance. It can be a real help. I mean, even if you just put them side by side and see the differences, then that's going to help you too. But just leaving it at the door means that you have to learn everything all over again, as if you don't know anything at all. And that's crazy.
That's different ways of organizing your discourse, different rhetorical styles. Like there's this stereotype that Asian students like to start with this going round and round and round and without going to the thesis. So yeah, but we don't want to stereotype that too. So these are cultural styles. They are patterns. They are cultural patterns. And even within the English-speaking world, cultural styles of presenting your argument. Not every cultural style in the English-speaking world will start with a thesis statement. Okay, so it depends on the context, the audience, the communities that you are working with. So that's why translanguaging theory as a majority theory. That is even within the majority. But now I have this question from Arlene Spradlin, one of our postdocs here. She was talking to a colleague who teaches grade 5 and 6, and her students are mostly plurilingual in Canada. But it's very difficult to get teacher buy-in. So how could we help teachers to buy into the translanguaging idea and practices? That's from Arlene.
In my experience with teachers, as I was saying in the presentation, is that if you position it as them getting to know their students better, they get it. They understand it. Like they want to, generally speaking, at least with primary school teachers, they want to know who their students are. Like they usually like kids. Well, hopefully they do. They like kids. And this was something that they were very excited about, the fact that they knew their students more. They weren't actually talking about language as much. They were talking about what students were doing with their language and where. And this was, they loved it. And so I would say buy-in is about positioning it differently, selling it a bit differently, because people often don't know, well, why do we have to do other languages? It's English, you know, just English. That's what happens in Australia. I don't know if that happens in Canada, in English-speaking Canada or not, but it happens a lot in Australia. People just don't really, it just doesn't make sense. Like, well, yeah, speak whatever you like in your own time, but, you know, this is the real kind of pervasive idea. So if you hook it to something else, that's the way that I've been trying to do it. So hooking it to getting to know the students so the students are happier, that they're just happier in class is one way of doing it. Another thing that I've been trying to do is hook it to the achievement standards. So you can show that the students are actually learning this faster because you're allowing the other languages in. And I've had some success with that, which is really, really nice, because teachers really understand that, needing to meet those achievement standards.
Oh, talking about the standards achievements, I have this question from Jaja, a PhD student from Hong Kong University. It's a very good question to follow up on the standards. She's asking assessment, because mostly K-12 assessment and higher education assessments still monolingual in North American societies. So how would the translanguaging lens help to reform the way students are assessed, which is now monolingual?
In the Australian context, I realised I felt quite lucky. I felt fortunate in a weird way. Very strange. It's kind of ironic. But English is so taken for granted that the English curriculum just says language. Like it actually says the students need to do this and this. They need to understand language. Thought, oh, great. This is awesome. So that meant that the teachers could actually meet the curriculum, like the achievement standards, by bringing in, so the reform could happen kind of ground up, because the way that it was written was inclusive. I don't think they probably shouldn't say this out loud. Hopefully they won't change it. They'll probably just now write English in front of it.
I want to make an announcement for Dr. Saskia Van Wiegen and Dr. Sunny Lau and myself. We have a short grant, Canadian short grant for multilingual approaches to assessment, and we will have a online Zoom symposium in May, and Tsinghua has all the details later we can put out. So tune into that multilingual approaches to assessment in language and literacy in May. Okay, so tune into that, Jia too. Okay, Phoebe, you have questions to ask? Phoebe, can you unmute yourself?
Thank you. So actually, I would like to follow up the topic about productivity because in the 2017 paper you co-authored with Dr. Lin, you mentioned about a lot of parents or teachers, maybe their ideologies of monolingual practice originate from the expectation to push their students to get higher assessment grades and marks. And because it's so related to capital, your life resources, how you measure someone is successful or not in their academic journeying. But this kind of pushing factor is kind of zero-sum game mindset, because maybe they believe that with limited time, limited resources in the classroom, if the teachers practice translanguaging activities or games or introduce the strategies to their students, they steal their time to get connected to the target language. And this kind of mindset is so consolidated.
Maximum exposure theory, right, Phoebe?
Thank you. Yes, I need to be precise.
That's a half a century ago, okay?
Yeah, sorry.
In the 1970s. Maximum exposure theory.
Okay, thank you. And my question is, because nowadays it seems that a lot of multimodal meaning-making resources could be introduced in the classroom. So what do you think about if we try to renovate kind of creative art activities, introducing a lot of singing, drama, especially for younger bilingual and emergent bilingual students? Would this be helpful to promote translanguaging awareness, acceptance, and also facilitate the curriculum genre development? What's your perspective about this kind of resources?
Looks like you're making a comment rather than asking a question. I'll turn it over to Marianne. You're already having a conclusion. Okay.
No, but I think it's a good conclusion. I mean, I think that it's definitely a space where people feel more comfortable. You know, like it's awful. You know, like when we talk about linguistic hierarchies, there's also, as I'm sure everybody is aware, there's some serious hierarchies going on in schools in terms of subjects. Like there's core subjects, there's peripheral subjects. So, you know, I mean, I was an EAL teacher, so I was peripheral. I was always trying to find, you know, the whiteboard marker. Like, so there are those kind of hierarchies as well. So basically, I think that it's really good, and I think that translanguaging fits in those spaces really well, because those spaces are about self-expression, and so, you know, it really does fit. And I think people are doing some wonderful work in that area. You know, like the whole identity text thing. I mean, I started with that, like with the projects that I did. I started with identity text, with mind maps, because people love it. They love, you know, because they get to express themselves. So absolutely. What I try to work with is I'm also a bit square-headed, I've got to say. I just really like cross-linguistic analysis. I really like it. So I tend to work with trying to get language into core business. Yeah. So no, it's not just, you can't just, yes, it suits those spaces really, really well. And I love those spaces and everybody does, but that doesn't mean that the English teacher and the science teacher don't do it. You know what I mean? And the maths teacher. So yeah, I would say that we need to go for everything. But
yeah, I can summarize it. The translanguaging lens is both empowering and disruptive. Coming back to your two themes, Marianne, empowering and disruptive is difficult, but it could be achieved. And what is it disruptive of? Number one, monolingualism and monoculturalism. So it's not just, I need to get assimilated into the English-speaking society, so I have to speak English only, or the English culture only. So it disrupts and monoculturalism. Secondly, it's disrupting logocentrism. Logocentric, logo meaning words or verbal. That is, you just focus on, for your assessment, you have to write a long essay. It has to be linguistic product that is assessed, rather than multimodal semiotics, that is trans-semioticizing, other ways of expressing your ideas and your identity, other than writing a long linguistic product producing. So that's logocentrism. So disrupting monolingualism and disrupting logocentrism. That is everything, finally, assessment, we have to look at what you write in terms of linguistic text. So Amy has a question. Amy Wu, she asks about content learning now. How to persuade content teachers, for example, in Australia, mainstream content science teachers, social studies teachers, to have this translanguaging lens, any evidence-based approach. Arlene just told me, no, Ivy, one of my postdocs, Ivy Zhang, just told me her son in elementary school in Canada, in Burnaby here, science teacher, her son hates science lessons now, but Ivy has a doctoral degree in science. And her son, coming from Hong Kong, now in Canadian primary elementary school, hates science. So she talks to the teacher, and the science teacher says, "Oh, English language learners, I don't teach English. I just teach science. Go to the ESL teacher. She will teach your son." Okay. And you can see why her son hates science now, because the science teacher couldn't care about supporting students both language and content development. So back to you, Marianne, to answer Amy's question. How to get teacher buy-in from these content teachers?
Well, the work that I've done, I mean, in secondary school, again, I'm always looking for teacher buy-in to do with student engagement, and even more so with achievement standards, because that's what they're expected to do, and it governs so much of what they have to do. So trying to work out how to get the other languages to be in service to science, or to be in service to history or social studies, or whatever it is that the students are doing. And the success stories, I think I said before, I didn't really explain very well, I know, but in Japanese, so it was content and language integrated learning, and the Japanese was coming in for the year eight students learning science, and the monolingual, so there was a monolingual in English teacher teaching with a co-teaching with a teacher who was teaching Japanese. They were doing it together, and the monolingual teacher, in interview with me at the end, said that she thought that the Japanese was helping the students understand the scientific concepts. And I asked her to repeat it just to make sure that she really was saying that. And the students were saying it too, and the Japanese teacher too, because what they realized was it was the translanguaging that was helping the understanding. It wasn't just the Japanese or just the English, it was both together. So it was the fact that the one that just comes into my mind all the time is zygote. Zygote in English is actually really hard to understand, but the way it was coming back from the kanji was fertilize egg. And so look at those two, you know, as two characters, fertilize egg, and that was just so much easier for the students to understand. And it wasn't occurring to the monolingual science teacher to explain it in exactly that way. So they were getting an explanation and in English, and then they were getting another explanation that was coming through, it was coming filtered through the kanji from the Japanese. And so they were understanding things more deeply. But this teacher was teaching across the board. She was teaching maybe about 5 science classes in year 8 and only this one Japanese class, and she thought that they were learning more deeply. So that's an example of translanguaging helping, and that can also be applied more generally to students. You know, if you do have any character-based language in the class, then you could apply that. Social studies, an example of history was the students were learning Japanese history in a class. This was year 7, I think, and they were learning about the shogun. So the Japanese teacher took the opportunity to teach things to his advanced class, and then the advanced class were in history classes. There were probably about 8 history classes. It was a big school. They were scattered amongst the history classes, and they became kind of experts, like they knew things that the other people didn't know in terms of writing things in Japanese. And this was an engagement thing. So I asked other students who didn't speak any Japanese whether they'd like the classes and why, and a lot of them said they liked the fact that there was some Japanese there. It was engaging them. They found it more interesting, and they really liked knowing what these words meant in kanji. So these kinds of things, you know, there are ways to do it. And the nice thing about translanguaging is that you're not saying I'm teaching a particular named language. Translanguaging opens up so many possibilities. You know, you don't have to call it anything. You just call it learning. Like, we're doing this because we're learning, you know. That's quite nice.
Yeah, I have a question here from Jason Ho in Hong Kong. Jason asked teachers who don't speak some of the languages of their multilingual students in the class might feel uneasy, a sense of unease when allowing students to interact in their home languages. So how, this is a recurrent from teachers. Okay, yeah, we allow them to translanguage, but I don't know what they're talking about. I feel uncomfortable. So how do you handle that?
Yeah, this happens all the time. Like, because when I'm teaching the EAL in the mainstream, they always say that. But and I understand it as an issue. But at the same time, I say, really, like, if you don't hear people talking, like, you can't actually hear what they say. So maybe they're speaking in a language that you understand, but you can't really hear what they're saying because they're a little bit far away, or they're whispering. You can generally get a sense of whether they're on task or not. You get a sense of whether they're talking about what they did on the weekend or whether they're talking about the assessment. I mean, there are so many kind of different clues and hints that you have. So I think that I can understand why teachers would get a bit nervous about that. But I think that one thing that I've noticed with teachers is often it's the ones who are not, a lot of teachers feel that they need to be the expert because that's their job. They're supposed to be the expert. They're supposed to know stuff, and that's why they're there. It's the teachers who get a sense of the fact that, yes, you are supposed to know this, but it's okay not to know this. So if the students might know more than you in certain areas, and that's okay. That's fine. You can be a co-learner in those areas, and those teachers go far. You know, with translanguaging, ones who are a bit scared of losing control, and they can get quite anxious about it. It's much more difficult for them.
Yeah, I think I have a last question here, which now translanguaging is usually seen as a micro strategy in the classroom. And Professor Sakamoto, Michiyo Sakamoto in Japan, was saying that our society is constantly reinforcing the ideology of languages. Like in Canada, it's English and French, and in Australia, it's English. So school principals, and then April also had this question, school principals, parents, And we just we opened up our discussion with these students themselves, parents themselves, school principals themselves. Actually, they are embedded, immersed in a larger society, which is full of these emotions, ideologies, regard, desires. How do we disrupt with a micro strategy? But of course, Ophelia Garcia and Yi wouldn't say it's micro. They would say it is more than that. I would like to hear your response to these concerns.
It's a big question. It's a hard one. I mean, it's very hard. Like you can try and change. You can try and have impact on the space that you have impact. I mean, when you go out into everyday life, it just becomes a wall. It just becomes it becomes something that feels so overwhelming and so hard, depending on who you talk to. But you can, I don't know, like the only thing I can say is just it's a little by little type thing. And you know, for example, I was sitting watching my son play tennis, and the mother who was sitting next to me, we started talking, and we just started talking about language or whatever. And the language that she spoke at home was Malayalam. She was Indian, and she said that her son had come home from school all excited, say, "Oh, people are speaking different languages," and he said, "You have to teach me Indian." Why aren't you teaching me Indian?
There's no language called Indian. There's no language called Indian. There's Punjabi, there's Hindi, there's Tagalog, and wow, then you can open up a whole new world for the son, right? There's no single language called Indian.
But he had no idea. And so she felt really bad. Like the mother felt bad, but she said, "Oh, you know, well, I just thought it was more important to be teaching him English and to be speaking with him in English." And it meant that I could have this conversation with her about, you know, like there are different ways that you could speak Malayalam to him, you know, like you could be, you know, and it would be something that he can bring to school and he can be proud at school. So I think if as people, teachers and teacher educators, if you focus on the school space and try to focus on the fact that if kids want to do something, if suddenly it's cool, it's really cool to be speaking another language. Like in my son's school, for example, he said very proudly, you know, "I spent 1 year of my life in Spain," you know. And the next kid said, "Well, I spent 7 years of my life in Indonesia." And he said, "Oh, that's better." Like that wins, you know, like because it's cool, you know, like. And I think that as a school, if you can get to where it's cool to be, then that filters back. Like kids can then go back and say, "Hey, you know, you can be speaking in other languages to me." And that's something that's been happening in the projects, is the kids have been getting the parents to try and teach them more, or their grandparents to teach them more, because suddenly they want to do it. So that's the only, I know it's not a particularly broad answer, but that's my, I think of it as my sphere, as the only place where I can really impact.
I think Marianne, you point out one very important principle, which is the translanguaging lens helps us to shift away from the languages as the learning targets, but shifting to learning objectives, and also not just the individual speakers and learners, but the whole context, the whole society, the whole classroom. So just shifting away from named languages as a separate, like commodities. I want to have BBC English or CNN English, like going to the supermarket. Okay, and we are the providers. And I understand that that's the kind of ideology and atmosphere and emotional attachment in a lot of Asian Pacific societies, including Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, China, Taiwan. So it's just commodification of languages. And teachers are also commodified. Okay, so that's a huge research topic. But before we close because I'm aware of the time, we have gone on for 1 hour and 23 minutes, and without noticing it. So before we conclude our seminar, I'd like to have our host to have some final comments or mention your key takeaways, or before we close the seminar with Dr. Turner. Qinghua, you start first. Unmute yourself first. Unmute.
To switch the outsider mic so that the people on YouTube will be able to hear me. I would like to say thank you to Dr. Turner. I think it's a great opportunity for me to think together with her about those so many important issues. I wouldn't have come up to, I mean, my idea wouldn't have developed to now, according to the comments that I've made just now. I've never thought about the comments that I've made before. And I think each time we engage in conversations like this, it not only helps us to see these problems, to relate translanguaging with our own experiences, but it also brings us new insights. So I really enjoyed today's conversation. I would like to say thank you so much.
Okay, Phoebe?
Thanks for the time today, and it's really wonderful to listen to your live PowerPoint presentation to know more about the background and theories first, and also your demonstration of the Japanese English bilingual program. Today we don't have time, but our discussion about multimodalities and also creative art for translanguaging space maybe extend to your experience about serving students from immigrants group and also refugee camps and also learners with difficulties. I really would like to talk more and understand more from your perspective about how translanguaging should support social equity in long run as well. And thank you so much for all this wonderful sharing today. Thank you.
And thanks. And Pedro?
Thank you very much, Dr. Turner, for sharing your ideas and for your time. I think that the idea, the homework that I'm going to develop is this idea that the linguistic repertoire is distributed in all the activities that students do. Is not only translanguage is not only happening in one place. So I am already thinking about timescales and how we can think about different dimensions of time and people translanguaging. So this is my takeaway. Thank you very much for your time and for sharing your work.
Gonggi? Thanks, Pedro. Gonggi? Dr. Song?
Thank you so much, Dr. Turner, first of all. And I really liked my main takeaway is the theme of today's talk is the translanguaging as a majority theory, which initially in the past, I've been thinking translanguaging as something new that is take away from bilingualism, multilingualism, plurilingualism, now translanguaging. But now you've shifted my ideas of translanguaging as the majority theory, and then it opens a lot of possibilities. In particular, I'm getting more and more interested in how to think about translanguaging with a critical lens, and then also echoing the Qinghua's discussion comments about how to engage with the teachers. And you gave lots of examples and how to approach with teachers, how to tell or how to collaborate with them to promote translanguaging, which we do every day. And thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Before we close,
such a pleasure.
Marianne, you have any final comments?
No, it's been a pleasure. It's lovely to talk about it, and I know it is quite a complex topic, and it's lovely to have the time to just kind of really talk through different aspects of it. I do like the idea of the time scale too. We didn't get a chance to talk about that, and also the equity, the refugees. I actually did my PhD working with South Sudanese former refugees in Australia, and I think about them all the time, like when they're all often in the back of my head when I'm working. So yeah, but it was lovely to have the time to talk about what we talked about. So thank you very much to everybody.
And before we close, I want to thank our audiences from all over the world. We have audiences from San Antonio, Texas, from Maryland, Baltimore, and also Anna Mendoza from Hong Kong U, and also your students from Australia, and also friends from Japan and all over the world. And before you go away, just the next TLTS seminar, we will have Dr. Coxing Tang from Australia, Perth, Curtin University, and he will be talking about discourse strategies for science teaching and learning. That's March 27, Asian Pacific time. March 26th, that's 1 month from now, is North American time. So until next time, thanks so much again, Marianne, Dr. Turner, and thanks so much our hosts, and thanks to our audience. We have 35 people staying for an hour and a half of this seminar. Thank you so much. And you can share the link, the YouTube link, and to your students and friends and colleagues, and then also leave comments. So it's just the beginning of our conversation. It is a complex topic, and we are making a modest beginning. So thanks so much again, Marianne, Dr. Turner, and thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.